Sir Tony Blair has warned there needs to be a radical reset of irrational net zero policies because they are, quote, doomed to fail. The former Prime Minister says that voters are being asked to make financial sacrifices and changes in lifestyle that will have minimal effect on global emissions. He's arguing that a backlash against climate change policies is threatening to, quote, derail the whole agenda. Geoff, this has become a more political issue recently, I think it's fair to say. Is this a sign that the kind of mainstream consensus on green policies is collapsing?
Well, I hope not. And what I mean by that is I think we do need a consensus on accelerating our green credentials through energy policy, through home insulation, and lots of other measures that we need to take. Of course we do, because there is a climate emergency we need to tackle. But fundamentally, where I think our political classes have got it wrong, and I think it's north and south of the border, frankly, is that there's clearly a lack of understanding of the complexities around the policy issues here, and actually what that means for the consumer, the voter. I think Tony Blair is absolutely right on that. Can I just give one example here? We're all very excited in Scotland, particularly about the potential for offshore wind. It is potentially transformational for us, both at an economic level and an environmental level as well. But one thing that's not readily understood is right now, it is one of the most heavily subsidised industries that we have. You know, public sector money is going into port infrastructure. It's going into getting supply chain companies to relocate in Scotland ahead of the commercialisation. So what you're basically asking companies to do is come along, set up sticks here, and there is no real profits because there is no orders, because this is, as I have said 100 times before, a transition, right? We need to manage that transition. And so obviously it follows that significant public finances, taxpayers' money is going into these things. How are we going to get the return economically? And this is where the balance has to come into our approach. We need to be able to sell people a vision that says this is all worthwhile, because right now all we're hearing is this is going to impact you in your daily lives adversely. It's going to hit you in the pocket, and we're not seeing the benefit. We need much more pragmatism from our politics. And I do hope, you know, if Ed Miliband is listening right now, nobody's second guessing his passion for getting to a decarbonised industry and society as quickly as possible. What we're questioning is the method in which we're getting there. And I think that's what Tony Blair is trying to espouse.
Yeah. Andy, one of the things he says is he kind of points out that 2/3 of global emissions come from China, India, and Southeast Asia, and would by the end of the decade. China's increase in emissions last year was bigger than Britain's total carbon dioxide output. I suppose he's kind of picking up on the idea that some may feel that it's futile to kind of try this in the UK when it's such a small part of the global emissions picture.
And that is a very normal, you know, man in the street concept. It doesn't matter. Look, we're just we. It doesn't matter what we do, right? It's really all about the Chinese and the Americans and the Indians. And that's not an unreasonable point to make, I don't think, because a lot of what we are doing and saying on net zero is not really passing the sort of sniff test when it comes to the ordinary person in the street. Now, I think where Blair has got this completely right is if you look at, look at global growth. The world is still growing. Economic growth is still going, okay? I mean, I think the economic growth this year globally is projected to be 2.8% or something. So the world continues to grow, and the world continues to need more energy, not less energy. Now, obviously, there's a lot of renewable energy in a lot of different places, but until we have a large-scale storage solution of some sort, that renewable energy is not going to power us entirely right now. So we're going to need fossil fuel. And this is where the sort of person in the street test comes up, because the ordinary person would say, well, you know what? If we're going to need to use fossil fuels for a little bit longer, why don't we just use our own instead of buying somebody else's? And it's a pretty reasonable thought process, right? And maybe it would be better if some of the politicians went through that thought process. That's pretty much, as far as I can gather, what they do in Norway. If you look at polling in Norway, public sentiment in Norway, they are very favourable towards renewable energy. They are also very favourable towards fossil fuels and oil and gas, because they understand fundamentally that this is quite a long-term transition and it is not a cliff edge situation. So the Norwegians understand that. And I think my final point on this would be to say, and I've made this point before, We have spent too long telling people in this country that net zero makes you nice. We have not spent anything like enough time telling people that net zero makes you rich. We have got an incredible opportunity in Scotland. We've got an absolute energy jackpot coming our way here with the volume of offshore wind we've got, but we've spent far too long pussyfooting around and not actually doing what we need to do to exploit the commerciality and the economic opportunities that that will bring us. But a critical part of exploiting that is not jumping ourselves off a cliff when frankly we just don't need to.
Yeah, can I
Obviously,
comment here? Sorry, Andy, right? You mentioned storage solution. I think that's absolutely right. Also, fundamentally, this country has not invested in its grid infrastructure or capacity significantly for 60 years. I mean, and then we're asking to have this transformation on our doorstep. I mean, it's really, really regrettable that we've not taken the interventions that we have to increase our ability to get our power to where it needs to be in due and haste and post haste. Sorry, I want to just say one other thing as well, and it's the Climate Change Committee's own carbon budget, which essentially outlines that we're going to need 15 billion barrels of oil equivalent out to 2050, I believe it is. What I was reading from my presentation, it ran into a problem, so that's very frustrating because I had the quote right there. But essentially, we have the ability to half that by increased production, half that. And that will not negatively impact our carbon emissions as a country. Why? Because of what Andy says. All we're doing is relying on imports to fill that gap. They are not good for our environment. They're certainly not good for our economy.
we asked on Twitter this morning, in anticipation of having this conversation, for your thoughts. Fraser got in touch to say net zero has not made people poorer. It's up to government to be more proactive in making things better and cheaper for us, the consumers. It's madness for us to pay the highest bills in the UK and produce the most green energy on our doorsteps. That's not sustainable. And KS on Twitter saying, I'm finding myself agreeing with Tony Blair. That's not the start to the day I expected. I do wonder, Andy, if I can put some of the politics to you on this as well. And a question of whether the government's kind of perception, perhaps, of incoherence on this is a problem. Because Keir Starmer put net zero at the heart of Labour's manifesto for the general election last year, saying that 95% of the UK's electricity would be from green sources by 2030. It's also said it would ban new North Sea oil and gas exploration licences. That's obviously opposed by the unions, something we've discussed on this podcast. But the Prime Minister's also pushing ahead with a third runway at Heathrow and delaying plans to ban the sale of hybrid cars in 2030. It's easy to kind of look at all of that and go, well, hang on a second, I'm not quite sure what it is you're trying to achieve here.
Frankly, I think both governments, Scottish Government and UK Government, both have a split personality when it comes to energy policy, to be honest, and the transition. I think even for people like us who are pretty much in it as much as we can be, would find it pretty difficult to articulate what the consistent position of either government actually is. I don't think I'm being unfair when I say that, to be honest. I don't, and some of that's deliberate. Let's be quite honest with you. Okay, some of it is deliberate because they want to appeal to multiple audiences at the same time. But actually, this is getting pretty serious now, because we are potentially blowing a really pretty significant economic opportunity, which could be the backbone of this country for many decades and potentially centuries to come. We're not doing a very good job of it. So I think it's incumbent on both governments to be a little bit clearer about what they want. And the critical thing as well is worth mentioning, because this is energy policy, this is a very grey area when it comes to devolved and reserved policy. Both governments need to have a very big input into what is going on here. Now, they are working better together since Labour came into power compared to when the Tories were in power, but not well enough. And I fear that with an election coming up when these two parties are effectively going head to head at Holyrood, I'm not all that optimistic for how the co-working of both governments on this issue will be over the next year, to be honest. And I think another year of damage to this agenda is not going to do any of us any good.
Can I just come in on that very point? The really important to remember that, as Andy says, that energy is one of these policy areas that is interwoven between reserved and devolved competencies. So to give you an example, the planning and consent of a offshore wind farm will be the purview of Holyrood ministers, whereas how it gets onto a CFD process, i.e. its auction, its strike price and all the rest of it, and accelerates to commercialisation is the purview of the Westminster government. So clearly we need a joint industrial strategy as far as renewable energy is concerned. Absolutely. Final point is this, bit of fun here for you. Maybe shouldn't say this, it'll stop people texting me, but when I was on BBC Debate Night a number of weeks ago, I articulated the position on the need for a balanced transition, the point about not relying overly on imports, trying to reduce that reliance, and sustaining the supply chain, because that's the point here, the supply chain and the businesses that are going to be responsible for getting us to net zero. So we sustain them once this wonderful opportunity in offshore wind is available. I got texted by over a dozen senior politicians in different political parties saying that was spot on, Geoff, really good stuff. Really like what you said there. I'm not saying this to boast. What I'm saying is what's so frustrating is that they don't say it publicly. They just happily say it privately. They know, they recognise it's common sense, but they won't get out there and espouse these issues and promote them publicly. That's fundamentally what's wrong in our politics when it comes to net zero and energy.
Yeah, I think just on that as well, Geoff, if I can just put this to you, just as a final concluding thought on this particular topic. Obviously, Tony Blair's comments have been, jumped on by Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK. He posted on X, even Tony Blair now says the push for net zero has become irrational and hysterical. We are winning the argument. And, this is part of Reform UK's platform. They refer to it as net zero madness, don't they? And I wonder if this is their impact, actually. And I'm saying that, we're about to chat to Adam Bolton in a few minutes about local elections in England, the by-election in Runcorn as well. If Reform UK are building an electoral presence, is that likely to jeopardise any prospect of what you and Andy are both talking about there, a joint industrial strategy and delaying all of this by yet another year?
This is the point. Yeah, I'm not sitting here advocating for Donald Trump's or Nigel Farage's drill baby drill. We all recognise that we need to reduce our use of fossil fuels over time. But when you need it, it makes sense to utilise it from a homegrown domestic supply. And what the politics of this does is and what it is having, the knock-on effect is it's pushing voters towards reform, and as it did in America, it pushed voters towards Donald Trump, this kind of easy answer to all our ills. And I don't necessarily think that's right. So yes, our existing governments and the mainstream political parties have to take a long, hard look at themselves and be much more pragmatic, else you will lose votes to these parties.